Welcome to Adaptive Art. I'm Bette Naughton, author of Adaptive Art, Deconstructing Disability in the Art Classroom, and I will be demonstrating adaptations that will enable students with disabilities to engage in the creative process of making art. To build up the skills in the hand and the large muscles of the body, I often use these big hole punchers, which are great because they really take a lot of pressing. They also give the student a shape, so if they don't have the ability to draw stars independently, they can use a puncher to create their shapes and a pattern for their art making. So these are great to be using. They can be used with the hand, or to develop the inside part of the hand, they can be used with the pinchers, like so. Using hole punchers are also great. They require a little bit more pressure and skill, but they're great to develop the arm and the hand as well. Scissors are another important tool we must look at. We have everything from maximum assist, so this can just help the student guide their hand by pressing down. They're spring-loaded. This is another spring-loaded option, which is easier when we don't have a lot of hand strength. Allows you just to squeeze those, or a paraprofessional can squeeze the back part while the child holds the front part and learns how to use the scissors. A smaller one that works the inside of the hand muscles. And then you also have the ones with the extra loop on them to force correct finger position. When it comes to drawing materials, sometimes I'll use these crayons, which a lot of the students have what we call a tripod grasp or a doorknob hold, and they want to grab a crayon this way. Alternatively, they can also be used by putting them on the fingers to develop some muscle tone that way. There are many different types of crayons out in the market, so I suggest that you try a few of them to see which works best for your students. Some grow on very creamy, almost like an oil pastel, and others automatically sharpen and roll up so that they have an easier time using those. When it comes to painting, a lot of times students with gross motor skills don't have the eye-hand coordination to hit the blue every time they're trying to hit the blue. So sometimes I will do this, where I put a piece of paper across to isolate one color. It also helps students with cognitive deficits. Or maybe I'll use something like this from the replacement paints so that they can isolate and get just into the one color. On the topic of painting, there's many different brushes and adaptations to brushes. So this is just a simple wide brush that has a chunk of modeling clay around it, and you can use it that way. Or you can use a clothespin and a sponge. This is an egg handle shaped brush, which helps force the hold. Here's another adaptation, just using a cork in the end of a paintbrush. Or you can even just put a styrofoam ball on a brush to help students have something bigger to hold on than the handle of a regular paintbrush. A shaving cream brush is also another great adaptation. And if that is still too hard for a child to use, they can also roll paint on. I keep a bin of pattern rulers for students who can't draw their own background or their own stripes on a background. They could roll one on by dipping this into paint. Other adaptations for gross motor skills I like to use is a clothesline at the back of the room to clip artwork on as the glue dries, so that if it's hanging in the room, students have to use their pinchers to develop and hang artwork, or they have to reach up above their head, which builds trunk stability to add as they hang the artwork. So as I adapt, I showed you some tools. These are adaptations to actual lessons. And doing a lesson off of the famous artist who use hearts a lot in their artwork, it would be hard for a student with cognitive deficits and some gross motor skills to draw a heart on their own. So there's two ways you can do it. You can give them a heart to trace if they can't make one independently. But sometimes if they just paint that and then paint the background, they'll actually paint over their heart that they already did as they're trying to paint. So a good way to prevent that is to actually give them, say, both parts as you cut out a tracer, and give them this to put down first, and they paint to contain that. As you can see, some paint gets on here, And then when they go to do the background, you put down the counter image here so that they can paint around it without getting it on their image. Whenever I'm working with students with gross motor deficits, sometimes I'll give them a tracer if they can't draw independently, and I'll also let them work a little larger scale than their able-bodied peers. So you can give a tracer made out of oak tag, or you can make a thicker one out of foam or even heavy cardboard. If they can't create patterns independently, they can use pre-made patterns from paper or wallpaper, or they can create them using texture plates, which is another great pressing activity to build up those gross motor muscles. Here's another way to adapt a lesson, a simple still life. If they can't do the patterns, they could peel stickers and put them on, which is a great fine motor activity I'll teach you, or they can use pre-made patterns. Doing a lesson on fiber arts, the able-bodied students might be able to work with the fine thread here, but it might be a little more difficult for students with special needs. So if I had this requirement where they had to do 3 different stitches, I would scaffold back the project and make it just 1 stitch for my students with special needs. The first thing I would do would be to create one with thicker, I believe it's warp thread on there, and I would also use a thicker fabric or a yarn to weave with. If that was still too difficult, I might color code them blue, yellow, and give them something a little bit thicker to weave with so that it's easier for them to actually go over and under with as they weave. Again, it's just about fiber arts. If weaving is too hard for them to do, you could also just have them put different textures of fiber down and fabrics down to create their artwork that way. Giving students choice is very important. So in a lesson about musical instruments in my classroom, if a student can't independently draw, then I let them have a variety of different tracers. Or maybe they play the violin in music and they want to do a violin, I would make a violin tracer for them. So instead of just saying, here is a guitar, trace it, if you give them a choice of what instrument they would like to play, their artwork becomes more meaningful. Fine motor adaptations are meant to increase the fine motor skills that students use every day, whether they're picking up things, buttoning clothes, holding a pencil, and making things. One of the first things I do is teach students how to tear paper, and there's a right and wrong way of tearing paper. A lot of times you give them tear a piece of paper and tell them not to tear it up. They'll say, well, can I use scissors? But just encourage them that the tearing is a fun activity. So sometimes they'll just grab it and rip it like that, and that's not using any fine motor skills. What you want to teach is a pinch, pinch, pull method. So pulling it, pinch, pinch, pull, and tearing, using these pinchers, building up the pincher strength in the fingers and the hand. After that, I usually have them tear little mosaic pieces. Sometimes my students with special needs will just have fun just tearing piles of little colorful paper to use in a project. Here's an instance where there's a story of a little girl who made a picture by leaving the circle blank, and here they use little pieces of colorful paper to make a mosaic-like effect. Another torn paper technique could be using torn paper and the edges of it to create a landscape or a seascape picture. Using stickers is another great activity for students who also have cognitive impairments. They can use these to make a background. So you see when you start to peel off a sticker, and these are a little harder than other ones, but you're using your pinchers to pull it off and place it. So you don't want the paraprofessional just peeling them off and handing to the student. You actually want them peeling it off. If those are a little bit too thin for your student, if their fingers are a little more clumsy, then I suggest you get like little thicker ones. These are made out of the little foam pieces, but they're still using their pinchers. So there's different thicknesses of foam stickers. If this is too hard to use, then maybe this big thick one would be easier for students to use and apply. So those are another great activity. Anytime you can use small pieces for an activity, then get the children to actually make their hand into a little cup or hold a little cup, it's a great activity. Occupational therapists have told me that the thumb muscles are becoming overdeveloped and this part of the hand is not being developed enough, and that's coming from texting and too much gaming. So we want to build up the muscles in here, and that can be done by either putting some in their hand and telling them they have to hold it, and then that they have to use their pinchers and take and put each one on glue drops to hold them in place. So you could use mosaic pieces for a little mosaic project. You could do that with something like sequins or buttons that they have to glue on, or even beads. So I use beads for a lot of activities. A simple activity that I sometimes put in the center for students to do. If I see a student finishes early and they have some fine motor concerns, I might put this activity on the table. And it's just giving them a pipe cleaner and telling them to thread at least 10 or 15 beads onto the pipe cleaner. I usually put a limit because I get some kids that want to put 1,000,000 beads on. And then you can turn that into a bracelet, or you can make it a bookmark. But that's great eye-hand coordination and also doing some fine motor work. If those beads are too small for your student, then you can also shop for some bigger beads. I like to give a long piece of yarn or a lanyard, because then when they actually have to put the bead on, they have to pull it all the way down to the end, and that's crossing the midline of the body, which builds trunk stability and increases gross motors. So we need to build gross motor development first and then fine motor. Another option for large beads would be using some big wooden beads and stringing them together. When it comes to drawing materials, I like to make my pencils a little bit shorter and sharpen them down, or save my old ones just for this activity, because when the pencil's shorter, they're kind of forced to hold it the correct way using their pinchers. Same with crayons. If I give a student a full-size crayon, they can still hold it like this and draw, or hold it like that and draw, or we're trying to get them holding it this way. If you give them a broken crayon or a small crayon, then they can't grab it that way. They're kind of forced to hold it this way and do their coloring. So small crayons force. It's also good to draw some little tiny areas for an exercise and have them actually try to work on just coloring small, because when you're coloring small like this, you're actually really working the hand a lot as opposed to coloring big, or some kids will get there. The whole arm movement's happening, where if you work small, you're really working on your fine motor skills. Lacing is another great thing to practice. And whether you do it as a project, like a little fish picture, if you need a tracer, the student can have a tracer, but you can make this into a fun little rainbow fish project. As long as you're encouraging students to use their eye-hand coordination and focus on taking it and then pulling it through. Shoelaces are another great way to do lacing. Or you could even give them a piece of the foam and hole punch it and lace that way as an activity. Or turn it into a lesson for your entire class where they have to do some lacing. It would be the same with the mosaic pieces. You could turn the lesson into a class project. If I was doing something like this on ancient Roman art, I would have them, if they made the papers themselves, the students painted the papers and then cut them up, I would have cut them first with a paper cutter in long strips, and then just have them do the little snips to make the squares or rectangles, so that you don't want to fatigue the hand.